To hear this and many more audiobooks not available on YouTube in a podcast feed, please visit the first link in the description below, and thank you for your support. The Unknown Cultural Revolution by Dongping Han, 2008. Preface and Acknowledgements. I grew up in a Chinese village during the Cultural Revolution. In 1966, when the Cultural Revolution started, there were many illiterate people in my village. My mother never went to school, and my father had learned how to read and write simple words by attending night school in his factory. My elder sister had only 3 years of primary school education. In my neighborhood, many children who were a few years older than I either never went to school or dropped out after 1 or 2 years of primary school. Not many people finished primary school, and only a few went as far as junior high school in my village. During the educational reforms of the Cultural Revolution, my village set up its own primary school and hired its own teachers. Every child in the village could go to the village school free of charge. My village also set up a junior middle school with 6 other villages. Every child could go to this joint village middle school free of charge and without passing any examinations. The commune that included my village set up 2 high schools. About 70% of school-age children in the commune went to these high schools free of charge and without passing any screening tests. All my siblings except my elder sister, who was 4 years older than I, were able to finish high school. At the time, we did not feel this was extraordinary at all. Most people took going to high school for granted. Upon graduation from high school, I went back to my village like everybody else, and worked on the collective farm for 1 year and then worked in the village factory for 3½ more years before going to college in the spring of 1978. While I was in college, the Cultural Revolution, together with its educational reform, was denounced by the government. Deng Xiaoping, the paramount Chinese leader then, said that schools should be like schools. The implication was the rural schools set up during the Cultural Revolution educational reforms were not like real schools. At the time, I felt there was some truth in his comment. The rural middle school I attended engaged in too many things. It had several workshops, a farm, and a lab. Students had to work in the workshops and on the farm regularly 1 afternoon a week. Students also engaged in other money-making activities, transporting gravel to construction sites, cutting grass for animals, and gleaning wheat and sweet potatoes to help finance the school. I enjoyed these activities at the time, but I did not appreciate their usefulness as educational activities. In 1986, while teaching at Zhengzhou University, I was involved in a research project in rural Henan with a group of American historians and political scientists. The presence of foreigners in a rural village attracted a big crowd of children of different ages. Out of curiosity, I asked some children to read some newspaper headlines. One after another, they shook their heads. I thought they were simply shy, but other children explained that they were not in school. To my dismay, it was the same story everywhere that we went. I talked with people about why this happened. They told me that since the collectives were broken up and land was divided among individual households, village schools were no longer free of charge. Some families could not afford to send their children to school. Others needed their children to help in the fields. Girls were among the first to be sacrificed as they were assigned to household chores and to take care of their younger siblings. Their parents were more reluctant to invest in their futures than in those of their brothers. Rural children's loss of educational opportunities shocked me and forced me to think. The government attributed the lack of educational opportunities to the poverty of Chinese rural areas. However, I reached a different conclusion. It was not poverty that deprived the rural children of educational opportunities. Poverty is only a relative term. Why were the children of villagers able to finish high school during the Cultural Revolution? China's rural areas were poorer then than now. Cautiously and skeptically, I began to appreciate the significance of rural educational reforms during the Cultural Revolution. I myself am a product of these reforms. As an educator, I found it hard to remain indifferent to the sad consequences of the condemnation of the rural educational reform of the Cultural Revolution years. I asked myself many questions and decided to study the issue. However, I could not do the research in China then because the Chinese government did not allow research related to the Cultural Revolution. In 1990, I came to study in the history department at the University of Vermont for my master's degree. I decided to write my thesis on the Cultural Revolution. I felt that there was a need to go beneath the surface structure of the events that occurred at that time. After I entered the doctoral program in political science at Brandeis University, I was able to return to China a number of times to research in depth the evolution and consequences of educational policy in the country where I grew up. I decided to study the impact of the Cultural Revolution of educational reforms on the educational expansion in the rural areas and its relation to the economic development during that period as well. As I began to investigate the education reforms of the Cultural Revolution, I came to understand that they were integrally linked with a comprehensive program of rural development. I broadened the scope of my study to include the changes in rural political culture and efforts to advance agriculture and develop rural industry that were initiated during the Cultural Revolution decade. I conclude, based on the evidence I present in this book, that educational reform, changes in political culture, and rural economic development were closely linked. I received much encouragement from professors and friends for the research I did both for my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation. I also received institutional support that enabled me to make 5 field trips to China's rural areas and conduct substantive research on rural educational reforms. I received a summer research grant from the University of Vermont, 2 Sacker summer research grants from Brandeis University, and finally a Spencer Foundation dissertation fellowship. During the course of the research and writing of this study, I have accumulated intellectual debts to numerous professors, colleagues, and friends. Professor Peter Sabolt advised my master thesis. He gave me valuable guidance and tremendous encouragement, both at the master thesis stage and during the writing of the dissertation. I feel very indebted to him and his wife who read my master's thesis as well. Professor Ralph A. Thaxton, Jr. guided me through the research and writing of the dissertation. He read the manuscript several times, giving advice for improvement each time. Professor Thaxton and I have fought many friendly battles over this thesis on rural educational reform and my own interpretation of the Cultural Revolution in the countryside. I am enriched for his advice and challenges. The Spencer Foundation asked Professor Stanley Rosen to be one of my critical mentors. He gave me very important suggestions for improving my work. I am also indebted to Professor Ruth Morgenthau and Professor Gary Jefferson for their advice and suggestions while on my dissertation committee. Professor Keith Bockelman, my colleague at Western Illinois University, read and commented on my dissertation extensively. Finally, I am greatly indebted to my friend Joel Andreas and his mom, Carol Andreas. They spent more than 1 week helping me overhaul the dissertation into a book format. I want to express my special thanks to many farmers and former rebel leaders in rural Shandong and Henan who spent time sharing with me their thoughts and experiences related to the Cultural Revolution, then a forbidden topic in China. Because they did not want me to use their real names in my work, I can only express my indebtedness to them in a very general way. Without their willingness to share with me their experiences, this book would not have been possible. Since it is in large part an attempt to tell their stories and experiences regarding the educational reforms of the Cultural Revolution, it is only proper that it be dedicated to them. I also want to thank my editors, Mark Henderson, Nicole Ellis, and Becca Murphy, for their meticulous attention to the details of the book. I am responsible for all its mistakes. Dongping Han. Introduction. Are efforts to attain social equality and efforts to attain economic development contradictory? This is one of the conclusions often drawn from the collapse of the great socialist experiments of the 20th century. Political utopianism, it is reasoned, had to give way to economic pragmatism. In China, this view has been strongly promoted by the government for the last 2 decades. The radical egalitarianism of the Cultural Revolution decade, 1966 to 1976, official history maintains, led to economic disaster. The official assessment is widely endorsed by Chinese intellectuals and echoed by Western academics. Indeed, in many accounts, the Cultural Revolution has become symbolic of the disastrous economic consequences of the pursuit of egalitarian goals. This book challenges this view by reassessing the impact of the Cultural Revolution on rural development. Carefully examining the history of a rural county in Shandong Province, this study contends that the political convulsions of the Cultural Revolution democratized village political culture and spurred the growth of rural education, leading to a substantial and rapid economic development. Each of these claims is contentious. The Chinese government maintains that the Cultural Revolution trampled individual rights, devastated the education system, and led to economic catastrophe. The reader is invited to examine the evidence from Jimo County, gathered from local interviews and county records, presented in the following chapters. The first chapter recounts the relationship between Jimo peasants and the Communist Party during the Civil War, the promises the party made to the peasantry and the betrayal of these promises as communist cadres gradually assumed the traditional autocratic political culture of rural officials, their power over villages augmented by the collective structure. Chapter 2 describes the perpetuation of the urban-rural education gap during the first 2 decades of communist power, and how the rural education system, instead of educating the rural population, acted as effective siphon, draining talent from rural areas. The third chapter describes the successes and failures of the first years of collective economic organization, and points to obstacles to rural economic development, including the lack of democratic participation and education. Chapter 4 presents an account of how the Cultural Revolution in Jimo began to change the political culture by enabling villagers to challenge local officials and opening up possibilities for institutionalizing mass participation in decision-making. Chapter 5 documents the massive expansion of rural education during the Cultural Revolution decade, which allowed virtually all Jimo children to attend primary school and lower middle school, and over 2/3 to attend upper middle school. Despite obvious shortcomings, these new schools, it is shown, produced the first cohorts of educated youth who remained in the village. Chapter 6 documents the rapid growth of agricultural production and rural industry in Jimo during the Cultural Revolution decade, highlighting the foundations provided by the development of infrastructure, experimentation, and mechanization. The expansion of rural education, local initiative, and mass participation, it is argued, were crucial to these advances. Chapter 7 outlines some of the consequences of the reversal of Cultural Revolution reforms and the dismantling of rural collectives, including the growth of official abuse and corruption and the collapse of rural education, healthcare, and social welfare systems that depended on the collective economy. While Jimo's economy has continued to grow rapidly during the period of market reforms aided by Jimo's advantageous geographic position, questions are raised about the threats to future development that long-term deterioration of productive infrastructure and rural education present. This study, thus, presents evidence that the egalitarian policies of the Cultural Revolution not only did not hinder economic development, they actually played an important role in advancing the rural economy in Jimo County. National statistical evidence is cited to show that the advances in both education and production in Jimo were not unique. The sharp contrast between the assessment advanced here and the official government assessment undoubtedly results in part from a difference in perspective. The official assessment is largely the work of officials and scholars who, because of their social positions, were subject to attack during the Cultural Revolution. Almost all published accounts are written from the perspective of urban elites. This book presents a rural perspective, one rarely found in the current literature on the Cultural Revolution. From different perspectives, you see different things and see the same things differently. Radical efforts during the Cultural Revolution to level the social hierarchy of education, for instance, had very different impacts on urban universities and rural middle schools. Introducing Jimo County. Jimo County is where I grew up. I decided to study the history of a single county in depth in an effort to ground social science theory in the reality of people in a small place over time. I chose Jimo because I felt that I could get at local knowledge best by going back into the local society of which I have been a part and where I have an intimate connection with the local people. Jimo County is on the eastern part of the Shandong Peninsula near the port city of Qingdao. It covers an area of 1780 square kilometers and is composed of 30 townships, formerly communes. Within these townships, there are 1,033 villages. The county seat is the town of Jimo, with a population of 61,327. Today, over 1 million people live in Jimo County. The population has steadily increased since 1949, when there were 656,634 people. When the first national census took place in 1952, population density in Jimo was 341 people per square kilometer. By 1987, the population density had reached 560 people per square kilometer. With changes in the developmental philosophy of the central government over the years, jurisdiction over Jimo County has changed several times. When the central government stressed agriculture, Jimo was shifted to either Laizhou or Yantai prefectures. When industrialization was stressed, Jimo was shifted to the jurisdiction of Qingdao City. The frequent changes in jurisdiction made the Qingdao City and Laizhou and Yantai prefectures feel insecure about Jimo County, and they all tended to withhold capital investment in the county. In 1981, Jimo County had a total of 2,670,000 mu land, of which 1,626,900 mu, over 60%, was farmland, and nearly 8% was forest and orchards. Footnote: a mu is about 1/6 of an acre. End of footnote. Wasteland, bare mountain surface, roads, rivers, reservoirs, and residences took up the rest. On the national land quality scale of 1 to 8, Jimo had no first-grade land. About 197,000 mu was classified as second grade, 1,172,600 mu as third grade, 326,100 mu as fourth grade, 217,700 mu as fifth grade land, 52,100 mu as sixth grade, and 2,050 mu as eighth grade. Historically, Jimo was a poor place. Before 1949, Jimo's economy was almost entirely agricultural. The northwest third of the county is a lowland area about 20 meters below sea level. The land in this region long had a high level of salt and alkaline and was vulnerable to frequent floods. Jimo people frequently had to flee their hometowns and go to northeast China during difficult times. Local people called this journey Chuangguangdong, venture into the northeast. However, the last of this kind of population exodus in contemporary Jimo occurred during 1959 and 1961, when 3 years of consecutive droughts and floods plus mismanagement during the Great Leap Forward led to a severe food shortage. About 77,900 people left Jimo for the northeast during these 3 years. From 1961 to 1978, when Jimo County was one of the 17 counties under the jurisdiction of Yantai Prefecture, it ranked 16th among them in wealth. Since 1978, Jimo County has been one of the 6 counties under the jurisdiction of Qingdao City, and it ranks as a poor county among them. However, compared with the rest of the country, Jimo's productivity is relatively high today. Much of the data gathered for this study was gathered in South River and neighboring villages in Chengguang Township. There are 50 villages, formerly productive brigades, in this township. South River is the village where my family lives. In 1956, the village was organized into Liming Shi, Liming Cooperative, and became part of Chengguang Commune during the Great Leap Forward. At the height of the Great Leap Forward, the village was divided into 4 teams, 2 teams in the eastern part of the village and 2 teams in the western part of the village. My family belonged to the second team in the eastern part of the village. Following the failure of the Great Leap Forward, the size of the production teams was reduced by splitting each team into 2. First team became Team 1 and 2. Second team became Team 3 and Team 8 in the eastern part of the village, while the old Team 3 became Team 4 and 5, and old Team 4 became Team 6 and 7. Each team managed its own production, with a team committee including a team head, a deputy head, an accountant, a storekeeper, work points recorder, and woman team head. Of these 8 teams, production Team 1 was the best, and important village leaders were from this team. Their land was better and closer to the village. The value of work points in this production team was generally a few cents higher than other teams. Team members got more grain and cash at the end of the year. Jiang Zhichuan served as the head of the production team throughout the collective period. Team 2 had about the same amount of land of similar quality. It did pretty well, but not as good as Team 1. The team's leadership changed a few times over the years. Team 3 and Team 8 had poorer land. Their land was also furthest away from the village, but Team 3 did better than Team 8 during the collective period. During the Cultural Revolution years, Team 8 had to change its leadership almost every year, and the team was highly divided. In 1967, the team was actually divided into 2 groups, one led by Liu Chongrui and the other by Guang Dunlin. However, the village and the commune leadership did not sanction the splitting. They had to merge again half a year later. Of the 4 teams in the western part of the village, Team 4 and 5 did better than Team 6 and 7. Team 7 was the worst among the 4 teams. In 1976, with the improvement of collective economy, the 8 teams merged into 4 teams again to increase the relative equality among the teams. My family fell into the second team again in the eastern parts of the village. Among the 50 villages in the commune, South River's performance was far below average. It was nicknamed a Lao Da Nan, an old headache case, and the commune constantly sent its representatives to the village to help it improve performance. It did poorly not because its land was particularly poor. Villages like Yao Tao had worse land and did much better than South River. Many villagers believed that their leaders had too much infighting among themselves. While this is a case study of only one county, there is no reason to think that the experience of its people is not similar to that of people in many other rural counties. In fact, I have also done interviews in rural Hainan province and have found, through preliminary research involving 40 randomly chosen local county records, striking similarities to my findings in Jimo. Footnote: I purchased and asked my friends in China to purchase for me these county records without any preference. We simply bought whatever we could. End of footnote. Methodology and sources. For quantitative research on Jimo County, I relied on the Difangzhi, local records, that have become available in the last few years. These records were edited by local historians under official auspices, as is the tradition in Chinese historiography. Although tending to reflect the current official political culture, they nevertheless contain valuable information that can help reconstruct the landscape of recent Chinese political history and help us understand the events of the Cultural Revolution. It should be noted that because of official condemnation of the Cultural Revolution, if there is a bias in the accounts presented in these records, it is not towards presenting Cultural Revolution endeavors in a positive light. For qualitative research, I have conducted more than 200 interviews with farmers, workers, school teachers, students, parents, and local leaders in the rural areas of Jimo County. These interviews were conducted over a number of years. Oral histories by rural people are valuable sources for social science research. Often unsophisticated, rural people reveal their feelings, emotions, and political attitudes through conversations focused on the subtle details of their daily life experiences. It is important to emphasize that Chinese farmers, like other people in Chinese society, have their own way of conforming to the political correctness of the time. Some of them do not want people to see them as being unsophisticated and unacquainted with what is politically correct or what is incorrect. Sometimes they will guess or try to pick up hints of interviewers' political biases and try to adjust their answers to questions posed to them. This would lead to distortion of the truth the interviewers seek. Rather than either claim neutrality or declare my own political biases when approaching interviewees, I have sought to make my own research agenda insignificant to them. Before interviewing, I prepare a questionnaire for myself in order to structure my questions, but interviewees never see this questionnaire. Instead of asking farmers to answer direct questions, I want my interviewees to tell me their life stories, with a natural flow of memories without interruption. I start by inquiring about a farmer's experience during a particular period or event in a very casual manner. Questions are asked only according to the logical flow of the farmer's memories. Even when a farmer started to ramble, I did not interrupt him, playing the role of a mere recorder of the farmer's story. I believe even this kind of rambling, the rambling has an order and significance of its own, can provide me important information I may not be able to get otherwise. My conversations with farmers always take place in a casual and relaxed home environment. This approach reduces the interviewee's burden of seeking political correctness. I eat with interviewees, sleep in their homes, and sometimes work with them in their fields and do household chores, helping create an atmosphere of trust. I was treated as a trusted friend more than a researcher or scholar. Apart from these major sources, I also used materials from the Chinese press. During and after the Cultural Revolution, there were heated debates in the Chinese press regarding the direction and philosophy of education. Often one-sided, these press articles nonetheless reveal a lot about the role of the Cultural Revolution in the process of educating Chinese society. Between 1990 and 1997, I also corresponded with a broad spectrum of people in China regarding my research topic, including correspondence with former teachers, former classmates, farmers, workers, and soldiers who participated in running schools and compiling textbooks and other activities. These informal letters, several dozen in all, are another important complement to the information I gathered from interviews. They were produced with careful thought on the part of the writers.